Hello and welcome to LCC, Library of Congress Classification. I am your instructor, Robin Fay, and today we're just going to cover a brief introduction, talk about some of the terminology, and just kind of get us ready to dive into actually building call numbers and all of that kind of stuff. So next week we'll dive much deeper into it. Today we're just going to look at call numbers, talk about call numbers, and talk about how this whole process works. You will notice that each week there will be a class session, and I will try to get that up as soon as I can. We will have that weekly discussion each week, and that is part of your grade. We will be working with the schedules. We'll talk more about what the schedules are as we go along. And then, of course, you'll have exercises and or assignments. So sometimes it will be more of an exercise where you'll actually be building call numbers or answering questions about call numbers, interpreting call numbers. Other times it will be more like a read and react as you are doing for the week one. So this, as I mentioned already, this class we're going to have a brief introduction to the Library of Congress classification system, and then we're going to talk about some of those resources, and I'll point those resources out as we go along. Really what we're looking to do is find a way to assist our users in finding our resources. And so we need some way to actually organize our resources in terms of the physical locations, in terms of those physical places on the shelves. If you have a very small collection, if you have a little small library collection of your own, if it's just a few shelves, then you know you have a lot more choices in terms of how you can organize it and still find things. As you get bigger and as you have more and more resources, and maybe you start mixing in other formats like DVDs and um, you know, maybe you have VHS tape still, or you have audio cassettes or whatever other resources, and you try to figure out the best way to organize them, quickly becomes pretty evident that having some sort of organization system is going to be important and useful. So that's really what we're looking to do with any classification system, is we are looking at how do we organize those materials and actually group them together to make it easy to find them. And library classification is considered to be an aspect of library and information science. I think we all know that. But it is different from other classification systems out there. You might have studied when you were maybe studying biology at some point in your life, you may have studied the scientific classification, where things actually have an order and in terms of how they're classified according to their species and things like that. Library classification is a little bit different from that. It's really about providing that useful order of documents, or in the case of what a lot of libraries collect, just a variety of resources, rather than that theoretical organization of knowledge. This is all coming from Wikipedia's definitions, but I think they're spot on in this way. It also, and I think for our end users, this is the part that impacts them the most, it is that practical purpose of creating a physical ordering of documents or resources. But it does attempt to adhere to scientific knowledge, or sort of that world of knowledge as we kind of think about it. Library classification is distinct, but these two are so integrated for many of us that it's really almost hard for us to kind of step back and separate them. So if you're in a library that uses Library of Congress classification and Library of Congress subject headings, these two may seem so intertwined, it may almost seem impossible to separate them, but we will do our best in this class to kind of break it apart while at the same time understanding that relationship. I've worked in libraries that used Library of Congress subject headings and Dewey, or that use Dewey and Sears, or use Library of Congress classification and Sears. So there's all kinds of ways that it can work together. The classification is not necessarily defined to only be used with one particular type of subject headings. So it really is distinct from that application of how we decide which subject headings we're going to use, which controlled vocabulary we're going to use. The characteristics that make up a bibliographic classification demand, for the sake of reaching the purposes of having that systematic order of knowledge, a useful sequence. So think about what sequence. We kind of think of sequence as being numerical in a certain order, a sequence of subjects at all levels, and then a concise, memorable notation, which for many of us, we just think call number when we hear notation, but it's a little bit more than that. And then a sort of a whole group of techniques and devices in terms of coming up with that, how you come up with that number. And so what we're going to focus on for this class, once we get past talking about some of this theoretical stuff in class 1, is we're really going to focus on that number synthesis. How do you come up with that number? How do you come up with that call number? And so that's really what the majority of this class will focus on. Now, in terms of what I will discuss and cover in classes, I will try to cover and include as many examples as I can, but I am really going to be focused on sort of practical knowledge as well as some of that theoretical knowledge and talking more about the structure and how things fit together as a whole. And in your exercises, that is really where you're going to be spending that time. So in every set of your exercises that you will do, you will need to allot time to be able to sit and work with the schedules. And we're going to talk about sort of the 3 different resources you can really use for that. You do have a class web login. So that's really what I would prefer for you to use. But if you have something else that you really like to use, if you want to use the print PDFs or something else, you can, but the class web is really a great opportunity to explore it if you've not used it before. So of course, you know, I already mentioned Dewey a little bit. So we have libraries that use the Dewey Decimal Classification, and that's a very numeric notation. And then we have others that use LCC, the Library of Congress Classification. Dewey has been around longer. Melville first started talking about it in 1873, and it actually kind of then rolled out into implementation in 1876. So it kind of depends upon what your take of when it actually started. Some people like to use the 1873 as the starting point because that's really where he was starting to work on it and talk about it. But 1876 was really that first implementation of it. The Library of Congress, well, it's the Library of Congress. So with the Library of Congress, it started with the Library of Congress, so that was 1897. Now, you know, the classification system has pretty much been built by the Library of Congress. We're going to talk a little bit about where it deviates, but there are sort of that local practices, and we'll talk more about local practices at the very last class, more like how that impacts it, but it is sort of part of what we do too. If you are in an academic or research library, or maybe you're in some kind of special library, some kind of special collections library, you may be more likely to see the Library of Congress classification in your library than if you're in a public library. I have worked in an academic institution that they were half Dewey and half LC, so it was kind of that weird mix. So there are certainly libraries that don't necessarily fall into this category that may, you know, sort of be a public library using LC, or it may be a academic library that's using the Dewey classification. The classification, as we've already mentioned, can be separate from the subject heading. So you can still use the subject, whatever subject headings, controlled vocabulary you want to use, that can be kind of separate from what you're doing. I will say this, from having done this work, it is a little bit easier to take a Library of Congress subject heading and then figure out what the notation or call number would be, as opposed to trying to work it from the Dewey aspect. And so it's one of those things of, because the Library of Congress subject headings correlate most directly to the Library of Congress classification, it's going to be a little bit easier, but that's not to say that it can't be done. And really, you could use even some kind of classification you made up yourself and work with the Library of Congress subject headings. So subject headings are just a form of a controlled vocabulary. And I wanted to just kind of touch on this. I'm going to move this down here a little bit because I notice it's in the way. See what I can do about moving it. All right, let's see, I think that's as far as I can move it. So a controlled vocabulary is a controlled, and by controlled, we really mean authorized or standardized. And so sometimes you'll hear people talk about, and you may even talk about, authority control. And what does authority control really mean? Well, authority control means that we are using standardized forms using standardized terms, using standardized forms of a person's name. We're using the form in that authority record, and we are applying control over that particular record in terms of saying this person's name will be used as this. So it's our way of applying some kind of standardization across it. A vocabulary, in terms of what we think of a vocabulary, is just a list of terms. So for libraries, it means, for most of us, the kind of controlled vocabularies we are using are I'm going to mangle that word, is a list of defined topic terms established by the community, and they are a hierarchy. And how this process works is, as the cataloger, as the person, as you will be doing, if you are doing subject analysis, you're going to go in and look at your controlled vocabulary, whichever one it may be, and you are going to select the most precise term that describes your item's aboutness. In library metadata, so in what we think of a bibliographic record, or like an OCLC record is an example of a bibliographic record. In library metadata, that first subject heading, and subject heading, of course, is that controlled vocabulary term, is considered to be the most relevant or the most precise for that particular topic for that item. And for those of us assigning call numbers, this is probably the part that's the most important to us, is that first call number is where we start our notation building. So we look at that first call number, that first subject heading, that primary subject heading, and we look at that subject heading, and that's where we start our notation building. So that's where we start looking for where are we going to class our item? Where is that call number going to start? Of course, we think about, how call numbers are used. Well, they're used for shelving. We do that. We use them for shelving. This is sometimes why when you see digital items, sometimes they don't have a call number, because it's not always useful to sort them that way. Sometimes, depending on what a digital item is, it will have a call number, and that will help it then in terms of shelf listing or displaying in that logical order within the catalog. But call numbers are used for shelving, and then they are used to group like items together. Typically, in libraries, it's going to be by subject. Sometimes there's local classification systems where you may say, for example, you group all your DVDs together and they're just numbered DVD 1, DVD 2, DVD 3. They don't have any kind of special number. It's just, when did you get it in, and what number is it? Sometimes you will see local classifications that use the barcode number, or maybe the last 5 digits of the barcode number, and that's how they'll be shelved, and that will be a local classification. When you have those local classifications, they may or may not be tied to a subject. So they may have nothing to do with the subject. It may just be a numerical notation where they're just sequential on the shelf, or by the barcode, or by something else entirely. But really the point of doing this work is so that our users can find what they need. And that really gets to that part of that Ferber user task, which is one of the foundations of RDA. So I talked a little bit about notation, but I wanted to give you the definition of it as we go through this and start talking about it a little bit more. Notation is the system of symbols used to represent the classes in a classification system. And so we're going to talk about all those pieces in just a minute. But the basic principles of library classification is to group the items on the shelf according to their subject content. So that's primarily how we do it. Sometimes by literary or bibliographic form. Most of the time for the libraries, it's going to be by subject. LCC is alphanumeric, which means it has both letters and numbers, and we'll look at that and talk about what those mean. So here's some examples, and we're going to talk a lot about these as we go through. There's 4 kinds of notational symbols that you will see in a Library of Congress call number. You'll see capital letters, and we're going to talk about those in just a second. You'll see integers or numbers, and then you'll see alphabetical order numbers, and these are actually called cutter numbers, and we're going to talk about those too. And then dates. Dates in some ways well, I would say they're the easy one, but if you've ever worked with special collections material where it's hard to figure out exactly what date something was published, that's not always the straightforward answer. But you will see in the Library of Congress classification, the capital letters will be 1, 2, or 3-letter combinations. There are not many 3-letter combinations. If you work in the law class, you will see 3-letter combinations. Frequently, probably. That's the one area where there's actually quite a few 3-letter combinations. There are a few in the D's, there's a few in a few other classes, but for the most part, you're going to see 1 or 2. You're going to see a lot more 2s than you will 1, and we'll talk about why that will be in just a minute. Numbers are 1 to 9,999. And, you know, these are kind of all potential spots or slots, but they're not all used. So although that range is available, they're not all used. We do work in whole numbers, not decimals, and we'll talk really about where that differs, because that's sort of a big difference between Dewey, but we're always talking in whole numbers. We do have a few that have occasionally have decimal points, but when they have decimal points, although we sort of think of them as a decimal, it's not really, it really is just like the next whole number in a subdivision. So here's our basic list here. It goes A to Z. You know, it starts with those capital letters, and then almost all of these have at least the 2-letter combinations and sometimes a 3-letter combination. L's are another category that have the three-letter combinations. So a more pretty representation of our Library of Congress classification system is this, with all these nice little graphics kind of grouping things together. You can kind of see when we look at the Library of Congress classification, much like Dewey, we're looking at sort of what that world of knowledge is, or, you know, how is all of the knowledge in the world represented and how does it fall into various classes. So you have music next to fine arts, which is next to language and literature, and then you have sort of what we consider the science buckets: math and science, medicine, agriculture, engineering and technology, military science, naval science, and then library science is kind of in its own little category by itself, as is the general works. Now, one thing you may notice, especially looking at this graphic, is A is general works. So we start with general works, and what do we end with? Library science. So we go from general works all the way to library science, which actually I think is kind of a lovely, a lovely way of organizing the world of knowledge, right? We are the end of the book. So it starts with general works, and then library science is the last chapter in the book, which I kind of like that organization. I've always found that to be kind of pleasing when you think about it that way. There are 21 basic classes, and you will notice that there are some that are missing. What would be missing here? Well, for one thing, we don't have an I class. We also do not have an O class, and we do not have a W class. Now, if you are a library who has a lot of medical material or health sciences material, and you see some of those National Library of Medicine or NLM call numbers, they do use W's. So that's sort of used for them, but in general, sort of general LC classification, it's not there. Now, why would you think the I and the 0 would not be used? Well, it's because they look so much like 1s and 0s, right? And so as you create this call number, if you have a 1 or a 0, it could be very confusing in terms of whether it might be an O or an I. So eliminating the O and I, at least from the classes, is going to eliminate some of that potential confusion. Almost all of these classes are divided into 2-letter or 3-letter combinations. We've already talked about the 3-letter combinations a little bit. Each class was developed separately, so as you go through these and you kind of look at how they're organized, they're not going to all be exactly the same. It does typically fall from general, and then it will kind of subdivide down more specifically, but general will be sort of at the top of that category. But even within that, there's some variation in terms of how things are organized. Oh, and there's also no why. So that's another call number that's not used. In theory, these are all available for future expansion, for classifying knowledge yet to be discovered. At one point, the K class, which is the law class, really up until, I don't remember the exact date, I'd have to look at it, but really up until the late 90s, it was not complete. And so when you actually looked in the classification guides, it was not complete, and you actually had to sort of make up your own little call number within that. So there are areas that are still being worked on. They are mostly complete now. I'd say now it feels like they're mostly complete. So there are subclasses, and I already talked about how it starts out like more general and then it kind of works its way down. Generally at the top of a subclass. So in the N class, which is in fine arts, it has a variety of subclasses, and we just kind of skip down to the ND subclass. So the ND subclass is painting. Now, one thing you'll notice when you're looking at the class web hierarchy browser, if you look at that, it's great to be able to see actually that hierarchy. What you won't see is when you go to the next subclass, if you are doing a browse search like this, you will not see the ND listed here. It just sort of omits that information. So when you are looking in the class web browser and you see a number and then down below here you see that it skips to that next subclass, then you would just know that this one, and here's, we're kind of skipping ahead to hierarchy a little bit, but this one sticks out more than everything else in this list. So that also is a clue to us that that is actually that subclass header. There are other ways to see the subclasses. So if you actually go in and do some browsing and things like that, you'll be able to see the hierarchy a little bit more. But when you're actually going in to look, if you went in and you search for painting, or if you search for, let's say you search for biographies of painters, then, you know, if you got into this category and then you're like, well, I don't know exactly where I am, you can kind of look at your hierarchy and you see here, for example, like we have women painters. If we had biography of women painters, so we have biography here, and then we're going to indent down to women painters. So there'd be women painters, and then where does it go up next? Well, this is a collective, so this is going to be like a collection of women painters. So we had women painters, and then it goes up collection, and that would be biography, and then it goes up to painting. So it's in the category of painting. And the reason why artists go with their subject is because that is how it is defined in the Library of Congress classification. So if you had something that was about painters, you would look in the painting category, and most likely you're going to look in biography, but you would also look under the types of things they did, like drawing and stuff like that. So that's something that's a little bit different when you look in class web, is that when you look at the hierarchy, you really do want to make sure that you sort of read your way through the hierarchies we just did. The really nice thing about classification web is you can search, which is wonderful, and then you see all these notes here that say see. So if you come upon something that tells you to see something else, you need to go look at that other thing if it pertains to your topic. So if we had periodicals about painting, painting periodicals, then we would want to go look at this and take a look at it. So it also, one of the nice things about class web is it does have a lot of cross references built into it, and that's very helpful. Here's an example of another cross reference up here. They're actually cross referencing with photography, copying, enlarging, and reduction of drawings, and then they're going to give you a cross reference to photography. So there's a lot more help kind of built into it, I think, than if you use the print or the online. But we're going to look at both. So here's an example of the LC classification online view. So this is on the web and is freely available. And you know, it gets a little bit tricky in terms of working with these. Sometimes you can click and go to each subclass, but you're not going to get as much information as you would get if you are looking at you're looking at ClassWeb. So ClassWeb is going to give you this very nice indented look if you're looking at the hierarchy, and it's going to give you all these great cross-references, whereas you're not going to quite get as much information as you would with ClassWeb. So you're welcome to use either, but you may try even experimenting with both. Use the ClassWeb online outline a little bit, and then maybe use ClassWeb a little bit and kind of see how they match up and kind of increase your skills in both. You can also look at the PDF versions, but those are going to be much more harder to navigate in terms of looking at the classification. Each subclass, I already talked a little bit about this, includes a hierarchical arrangement of the topics pertinent to the subclass, and it goes from general to more specific most of the time. Individual topics are often broken down by specific places, time periods, bibliographic forms, such as periodicals, biographies, etc. And then each topics are also referred to as captions, is assigned a single number or a span of numbers. So when you get a span of numbers, that doesn't mean you assign that whole span of numbers in your call number. It means that you need to dig down a little bit more until you figure out exactly where your subject's going to go. And we'll talk more about that as we go forward. Here's another example from ClassWeb. This is a great example in terms of seeing a hierarchy, but we have this, great hierarchy of subjects here, and then we also have some wonderful things here where it tells you sub-arranged by individual artists by tables in 6. So we have here painting, history, and then we're looking for special regions or countries. And if we go down to France, so France is sticking out here, so we're in the France category of history of painting, and we're in the modern time period, and we have actually special artists are their own thing, so they're not actually in the modern time period. So we have special artists, and when you then get this note here, it says special artists A through Z. So A through Z means you're going to put your artist according to that person's last name. It's going to be someplace in A to Z. Well, how do you figure out what that's going to be? So if you look over here, it says ND 553.A-Z. So you're not going to assign A-Z in your call number. You have to figure out what it's going to be. So if you had my last name, it would be F. So you get the easy one. The easy one's the person's, the first letter of their last name. So you'd have F for Faye. But then we would have to go over here to this table in 6 and see what it says about how do you do the rest of the name. And you would follow what it says in that table in terms of the name. What I really came here to show you, though, is that just how whole numbers can be broken down. So you see here we have these decimal points. So what you will do in terms of figuring out where you're going to start with your number, sometimes you will get very lucky where, for example, we have painting Germany and we have the Baroque time period. We know we have, Germany, we have Baroque painting, history of Baroque painting Germany, some book about that. And we look at our subject headings and that's what it comes out to. And then we can just put that in, and look and search, and lo and behold, we have exactly what we need right here. We have that ND 566.5.B3. And so that would be our base call number. That would be what we'd start with. So we could write down that part of it, and then we would go on to the cutter at that point. So sometimes, and a lot of times, you'll just know you're just going to take this base call number and then you move on with the cutter. If you see something that says A-Z, that means you're going to need, most likely, follow a table. In ClassWeb, it will tell you which table you will follow. And you will follow that every time you see this A through Z. Sometimes on A through Z, if you click on this little thing, it will actually, this little bubble kind of thing, it will actually take you to a list sometimes, and sometimes you can see other information too. Relationships among LCC are shown not by the numbers that are assigned to them. So it's not like Dewey where there's like that relationship with the numbers assigned to them. It is really only by indenting the subtopics under the larger topics. So it's much more like an outline, like you used to do an outline. Maybe you still do outlines, but it's much more like that. So this is very different from that strictly hierarchical classification system like Dewey has. So it really is very different in terms of that. So unlike Dewey, where you could just come out with your notation and you could really just make this really long notation. With the Library of Congress subject headings, you really are going to have just your base call number. So, it could be something like down here at ND 566.5.B3. So that would be our start. And we would record exactly as it appeared there to start with. And then we would do our cutter. And that's really all our cutter and our date. So that's really the only two parts of it that we need to do. So in some ways, LC can, I think, be a little bit easier than Dewey because you don't have a bunch of facets and things like that to do. But you have a more granular topic to choose to begin with. So, comparing Dewey versus LCC, there's a really nice Wikipedia comparison chart that you're welcome to use. There's also some correlation tools within ClassWeb that you can look at too. But just to kind of show you what it would look like. So, and you can kind of see the hierarchy a little bit. So Dewey, of course, we see the hierarchy when we kind of look down through our topics and kind of see how that they fall out. It's kind of general to, um, gets more specific, and there's sort of a relationship between things a little bit more. With LC, you don't really see that so much. At the top is that's your big class. So our class is Q, Natural Sciences and Mathematics. And then after that, there is not a lot of relationship between QA and QB. QA is mathematics, and then below QA is all the different kinds of mathematics, but then QB is astronomy. So it's in that natural sciences and mathematics, and while there is a lot of math in astronomy, there's not really any kind of relationship between them in terms of that. So they're sort of they're related in terms of being related in terms of that topic, but it's not that same kind of hierarchy where you have in Dewey where each thing is sort of related together. So I talked about structure, and sometimes it's helpful for people to kind of have sort of like a big map of like how the structure works. And so this is a couple of examples of a basic classification structure where you have this big class, sort of that top level class is superordinate. So super being high, sub being lower, and then you have your subordinate classes. And in terms of a classification system, those things that are parallel across are considered to be an array. And then we have, of course, more, subclasses down. This is another example where we have, of course, our big class up. I know this one's a little bit hard to see. Our big class at the top, then we have our parallel classes across the middle there. So those are arrays. Then we have some more subclasses underneath, and then we have another array. So, as things, it's sort of like a tree almost in terms of how the hierarchy works. And as you are working with LC classification, you'll kind of see more of that hierarchy, especially in terms of how the subject's put together. So we have the class, that's going to be that capital letter. The subclass will be a capital letter. So when you start out, you'll probably have 2 capital letters right there at the beginning, what you're starting with. And then you'll have your numbers, and this can be up to 4 digits plus a decimal. So it can be up to 9,999 plus a decimal. So that's where your subclasses start, although it's not hierarchical like Dewey. And then your cutter, this is really where you get to do the work. We'll start out doing classes and looking at the Library of Congress classification. So that will be what you will work on for next week. But you will then move on to actually doing some cuttering and things like that. So cuttering is where you actually are looking at the cutter tables to figure out that next part of your call number. And that cutter is typically, I would say most commonly it's going to be based upon the main entry, what we used to call main entry back in the olden days, but it still applies. And this would be your 100. It could be a 100 field, a 110 field, a 111 field, whatever's in that 100 field of a mark record, that 1XX. And so when you see XX, that means a range. So that means in a mark, and we're going to look at bibliographic records and mark records next week, but when you look at a mark record, the range, it can be from 100 to 199. Now there's not all of those, there's not 99 values that are used in that mark range for the 100, the 1XX field, but it's possible there could be. So when you cutter, you're typically going to look at that bibliographic record to see what information you have. And if you have an author listed and if you have a 100 field, then that would be, we would cutter by the author's last name. If there is no 100 field, no 1XX field, no 111, no 110, then you would look to the title, and we'll do some titles. So we'll do some of this. Literature is an exception to that, and we'll actually spend some time with literature. So, but cuttering is a little bit like a word puzzle. So if you like word puzzles, you're gonna love LC classification because it has always felt a little bit like a word puzzle to me. And then date. Dates assigned by the cataloger from the date of publication. In the olden days, if you look at OCLC and you find these really old records, sometimes you'll find really old records that say pre-mark. Those are records that were actually created, either created from cards, or they were from early electronic records that were before the mark formatting. They still exist. They're still in OCLC. There's a few of them still left. If you see those, sometimes you will notice that there will be no date in the call number. Date was not a required element for a long time, and there are some things that do not have a date in the call number. Serials typically do not have a date in the call number. Why? Because a serial is for a range of dates, and so typically you're not going to have a date in the call number. So there are a few things that will be an exception to the date category, but for the most part, if you have a monographic book, if you have a DVD, anything that's issued in a single year, it's going to have a date. So I already talked about this a little bit, but typically the base call number, that is going to be what you will add your cutter to, and your cutter will come from other information from your item, as well as the date will come from information from your item. That base call number, which we've been talking about, will come directly from LC classification. And if you need to, like that A to Z, where it's kind of like, oh, there's a range, they'll give you help. So there will be help to help you figure that out. So how do we read call numbers? This is something we don't think about too much. If we work in libraries and we've seen these a lot, we just assume we just know how to do it, and we just sort of do it without thinking about it, right? And we just sort of assume the process. LC call numbers are read from right to left, and on a label that's from top to bottom. So as you're creating your call numbers, when you start creating call numbers, one of the things that you will think about sort of as you go forward is, you know, if I'm going to create a label, how will this fit on the label? And we'll talk a little bit about where you can break, as I call it, break the call number, where you can make that call number wrap so it will fit on your label. We'll talk a little bit about that. Cutter numbers, I've already been talking about this already, but what are cutter numbers and where did they come from? Because they're not part of LC classification in terms of the actual classification schedules. So where did they come from? Well, they're alphabetical order numbers for libraries that were first developed in the late 19th century, and they were developed primarily associated with Charles A. Cutter, and he wrote a series of fixed schedules for them. They've been come to known as the Cutter number tables, and Cutter numbers is what they're called for, so they're just named right after him. Every combination of capital letters and integers or numbers, and with or without the decimal extensions attached to them, will ordinarily have one or two alphabetical order numbers attached to it. In other words, for everything you do in terms of creating a call number, once you get that base call number from LCC, then you're most likely going to add that cutter number. And it looks something like this. There's a little table that actually tells you, and we're going to actually go through this table and spend some time with it next week. But there's actually a little table that tells you exactly what to do with things. And we'll talk more about this next week, but just to kind of see what it looks like. So you remember when I talked about if you had my name and you were cuttering something and you had Faye, my name, and I was the author, so you knew by the rules for the particular item you were cataloging that it was by main entry for the cutter. So you have whatever my class is. Let's say it's something about technology, so it's going to be in a TK. And so you've come up with that part of your call number from the LC classification guide. And then you're going to cutter by my name. So it would be F. And then, I'm not on the list, so it's not an initial vowel. It doesn't start with a vowel. It doesn't start with S. It doesn't start with QU. So it's going to go in this fourth bucket after other initial consonants. So F, and what's my second letter? A, so it's going to be 3. And then I would say most libraries are going to do what's called for expansion, and you may go out more than this. So if you work in a large academic library, you are going to go out more than 2 digits. You may have to go out 4 digits sometimes, but this is how it works. So then for me, F, A, that's 3, and then for fourth, for my expansion, for my third, I'm going to be all the way down here at 9. So if you go look up something that's by me, my cutter would be F, 3, 9. And I don't have an E at the end of my name, but if I had an E and you needed to add that, it would be 4. So then if my name is spelled F-A-Y-E and you needed to go out another digit, then it would be F, and then for initial consonant for that next one would be A for the 3. We do for expansion, the first expansion would be 9, so F-A, F3, 9. And then if we need to go out one more, then that would be E, would be 4. So that's sort of how that works, and we'll spend a lot more time at the cutter table. Like I said, if you like word puzzles and stuff like this is almost like a little code game. So I think it's fun. Hopefully you will too. So why do we even do this? So what's the purpose of doing this? 2 purposes. We use it to extend further the class ideas that represented by the numbers, and to indicate those smaller subdivisions or subcategories, and to group things together. It could be by place, by language, type of material, and can be by people too. And then this one is the one that we most commonly use. Now, literary authors are a little bit different, but when you talk about sort of the general things in your collection of a general nature, to arrange items in a class already delineated by the symbols that precede the cutter number according to the alphabetical order of their main entries. So, and this is that shelf list piece of it, because once you get things in a group, then you need to find a way to file them so they sit next to each other on the shelf. So here's an example of like, what does that mean? What does sitting together on the shelf really mean? So decimal point is placed in front of the first cutter number in any LCC call number. So if you have a class and then it has a subclass with a decimal, you're going to include that. And then when you do your first cutter, and we'll talk about the mark formatting part of it, but when you do your cutter, then you're going to see if it has a cutter. If it already has a cutter, you're not going to add a cutter, but it's only when you are adding one that doesn't already have the decimal in it. And we'll look at examples and talk about this a little bit more. These examples, we do not have a what's actually called a second cutter. So when you are creating your cutter, it's technically a second cutter. So, and by second cutter, where that's coming from is when we look at one of these, gosh, I'm gonna have to go way back. When we look at one of these that already has this information in here, ND553.G3, this is actually a cutter that LC has assigned to further define that category. So then when you then did your cutter, for whatever you would need a cutter for, you would not add a second period. So back to where we were. So examples and how this works in terms of shelving things. You do, of course, you start with your class at the top, and that's going to be sort of an alphabetical. So HA goes before HC. So that's sort of the first part of it to do. Then number-wise, you're just going to read them out as number. In this case, we all have all 26s. Then you're going to look at your alphabetical list. So we have F, M, P. So FMP goes in that way. And then then you look at your numbers if you have things that are the same. If you have HC27, B, decimal B 62, these are all going to go before that because HC and then 26. So these are all 26. So those will go before that. Now again, LC will tell you this part of it typically. And then you would need to figure out this part of it. But you're going to start at the place that the LC classification sort of points you to. If you have a sort of that first cutter, that's first subdivision, then you're going to use that, and then you'll start with that second cutter process. If LC doesn't give you that, then you're just going to go directly to doing the cutter. LC does strongly encourage the classifier to not to end a cutter number with the digit 1 if at all possible. 0 is also sort of in that category too. It's one of those sort of areas where 0s and 1s can be a little bit tricky. I'm not going to go read through all of this, but you will have this. It kind of breaks down really that whole process we just talked through in terms of how things are shelved. So shelf listing is the act of checking your own catalog to make sure that the call number fits appropriately without causing a call number conflict. I'll talk a lot more about call number conflicts over the next few weeks, but a call number conflicts where you have exactly the same call number for different titles. There are areas that will deviate from this practice, and I've already talked about some areas that deviate from the practice of when you assign the main cutter, like literature, but there are some areas that deviate from this practice in terms of how we create the call number. Events, so anything that is event related, like an election, is one of those categories. Military regiments are another category where things deviate. And then there are other topics that shelf list differently. We already talked a little bit about literature. Artist, I alluded to just in our little talk about artist, and then maps are a big category where things differ quite greatly in terms of how they cutter. The fourth and final notation symbol of an LCC call number is the date. I already talked a little bit about the date. It is from the edition in hand, and it is the date of production. Date does not always need to be used, and we already talked a little bit about the date for serials. I would say if you can create a date, if you can figure out a date, RDA says to include a date when you can, to guesstimate a date, or if you can make some kind of sort of a educated guess with a date, to go ahead and do that. So RDA encourages that. I think we should try to add a date if we can, other than for things like serials. And I already talked a little bit about the practice of differing. So very occasionally a date may itself be extended by a lowercase letter, and I'll actually talk about this over the next few weeks, and we'll talk more about this in week 4 for sure, where we'll be talking more about additions. So we'll talk a little bit about additions. I won't give you anything that will be an addition for these first couple of exercises. So examples, here we have a book title, Uncensored War, the Media in Vietnam. It's by Daniel Halen. And so LC gives us this call number here, DS559.46. So that's the call number that LC gives us. And then we are going to cutter, and we're going to use our cutter table. And you can probably see from the cutter table, we have H, so that's coming from the first initial, the first letter of his name. And then we have, of course, the A, so that's coming from 3. You could see that from my example. And then we have the 5, which is coming from the L. And the year is coming from what's on there. So this is what kind of a typical book cover might, book spine label might look like. So DS559.45 is for Vietnamese conflict. So that's kind of how that works, and sort of now you can kind of look at that and sort of start reverse engineering it using your cutter tables and be able to see things. And in fact, this is a really good exercise to do. Take, even just look at things on your shelf, or even when you might happen to walk by another libraries, kind of look at what's on the shelf, and kind of, if it's a Library of Congress call number, just kind of take a look at it and maybe even jot that down or snap a picture of it with your phone, and just sit down when you have a minute and go through it and just kind of deconstruct it. Go back through the Library of Congress classification schedules and take a look and see what that base call number is, and then take a look at that cutter and then kind of see where it fits in the cutter table. Now, we're not going to be able to talk too much about call number conflicts, but let's say we had another book that was by David Howe. And it's also on the Vietnam War, so it would have Vietnamese conflict, so it'd also be DS559.46. And David Howe, H-A-L, well, that would be H35 too, right? So, if you were the cataloger who was cataloging Howe, David Howe writing about the Vietnam War, and you had Daniel Hallen, and you already had that book in your collection, or you were about to import that record from OCLC, and you saw like, oh, we already have H35 because I have David Howe, and this is Daniel Halen, then you would need to change one of those call numbers just a little bit. So what you could do is you could look at your cutter table and make one of them, which one would fall after the other. Halen or Hallen would go after Hal, right? So then you would, in theory, you would change Hallen. Now, that is getting to be a very nuanced shelf listing kind of thing. If you can't find the Daniel Hallen book to change, somebody's checked it out and you need to do this work, or let's say that you have a bunch of things that are HALs that have just been sort of squished in there. That's really where it gets to this art of figuring out what to do. So sometimes you even when you want to follow the cutter tables exactly, sometimes you have to kind of squish and wiggle things a little bit. It's called the wiggle room. So here's an example of a shelf of books with the call number order kind of explained. I think this is such a lovely little example. So one of the things to do is I've given you, there's a link to a couple of exercises, little games that you can play where you're actually shelving. And if you do those exercises, one of the things to think about as you're doing that exercise, in addition to putting those things in order, is thinking a little bit about what the parts of that call number mean. So, we have LA here. L's, of course, are class, and then the A is that subclass part. So LA is a subclass, and then we have 2301, which is a subclass, and then we have B37, which is our cutter. So kind of think a little bit as you're looking at things about how those call numbers are constructed. Here's another example, and we're going to be talking more about these kinds of things like that as we go through. But here's another example, same sort of thing, and you can spend a little more time kind of looking at these as you're looking at the slides and things like that. But the same sort of thing, like how things are organized and how those things sort of sort out on the shelf. So when you're doing your number building, you're going to look at the base number, and that's going to come from LCC for your topic. So you're going to be looking at the subject headings, your topics, and initially I'm going to give you kind of the subject, and it'll be pretty easy to kind of figure out. And then you're going to do your additional letters or digits, the cutter, and that's going to typically represent the author or title. We'll talk more about that in the upcoming weeks, and then the date. So the base number is going to be any LCC notation representing the class, category, or categories, and then the plus just means you're going to add those at the end. So you start out with your base number from LCC with any instructions to build that, and then you add to that the additional letters, digits, and cutter, and then finally you add the date. Other things I just want to kind of share as terminology that you'll see when you are looking at classification systems. There's this notion of hospitality, and hospitality is the capacity of a system to make room for newly inserted category statements. So in other words, it just allows us to be able to add more if we need to. LCC really is enormous in this because you can expand really infinitely to the right. And so as you are looking at, typically when you look at an LC base call number and it has the decimal, it'll just have like a couple or maybe 3 digits, but it has the ability to go kind of far beyond that. And then of course we have the ability to cutter and even make a more unique call number. So that's one reason why the LCC classification system is so useful for research and academic libraries. It has the ability to expand within the classification, and then with our cuttering we have the ability to be able to expand even within our own shelf list. So and to be able to shelve and organize things in our shelf list. So it is much more granular in that way. And of course, we have 23 classes to Dewey's 10 main classes. So, it has a lot more ability and a lot more definition in terms of being able to expand. Expressiveness, this is a term that's also related to classification system. And this refers to the extent that a system of symbols expresses the relationships among the different elements. So LC is a little bit more limited because although there is that hierarchy, in terms of the relationships within those hierarchies, in terms of that relationship, it's not exactly like Dewey where everything kind of is very much a hierarchy and there's a relationship between them. So LCC is considered to be limited expressiveness compared to Dewey. And the only symbols that even really represent the hierarchy are those capital letters and then the cutter numbers. And so it is a little bit different in that way. Now, does that really make a difference in terms of how we use it? No, but it's just one of those ways where we judge a classification system in terms of this kind of thing. So for example, one of the things that LCC does that's a little bit weird is that it uses a single letter for that big class, and then it will also use that then to actually organize things. So for example, the M class represents music, but then M also represents music, and then ML, so M and then tack on the L. ML is music literature, and then MT is teaching and music. So it's one of those things where it's almost like we kind of use some of it a little more repetitively. So as we wrap up here, just remember with classification, it's never purely about the subject matter, but it's really that sort of combination of everything. In terms of LC classification, you're really going to look at that first subject heading. So that's really what your target's going to be when you're looking at a bibliographic record. And that bibliographic record may have some other additional information attached to it in terms of the subjects and things like that and genres and all that kind of stuff. But really it should be that first subject heading should be tied to that Library of Congress classification number. The other part of it then, of course, you get date. So that's coming from your publication date. And then your cutter is going to come from, that's going to be your way that you're defining, sort of subdividing it and organizing it on your shelves by either the author's name or it could be the title. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we kind of go along. there are things that are going to cause a little bit of challenge, and things like books and web pages and films and photos, and when you have things like that, there's not really a way to kind of pull that information together with the Library of Congress classification. So like if you have a DVDs and you want them all to sit together, if you're using Library of Congress classification, then you're going to want to actually probably create your own little location to kind of shelving location to kind of apply on top of that. So there's not really a good way to kind of stick things together. Uh, of course, there's some benefits to what we do with classification. It's a way for us to organize work in terms of library work that is logical. The hierarchies lead users naturally towards broader and more narrower terms. And this is pretty easy to see when you are out in the library stacks, right? You can kind of see that relationship between items. Subject headings can be tied to call number classification, and for Library of Congress classification they are. And that creates a logical physical arrangement of materials, which encourages that serendipity. It's really easy to expand terms. Of course, some of the challenges, and I think we've had, I have a typo. Some of the challenges we have in classification, and I think this is one of the things that you all are already talking about some with the discussion for this week. It is a logical division of materials, but sometimes related materials get split up. This can be really challenging when you have those sort of series of books and things like that that aren't really a series, but yet they're kind of related, like the Harry Potter stuff and series and some of these other things. There's not always a logical subdivision of classes, or maybe not what we consider logical. There can be a delay in updating. How do we keep those things up to date as new areas develop? And they're not always the term a community uses. I think we all understand that. And of course, we've already had some discussion about bias. So, it is that there is that potential for bias, and how do we keep up with it, and how do we think about that? To learn to use the Library of Congress classifications, you need to understand the structure of the system, the relationships, how to read and interpret the notation, a little bit about hospitality and expressiveness in terms of practicing and applying Library of Congress classification. I don't think you really need to know that so much, except just to be aware that numbers may change, and you may see things change, or you may go in and look, you may get a new book and you think, well, gosh, where did this call number come from? It's completely, I've never seen a ZA, or I've never seen a JZ or something like that. And those have been around for a little while now, but they were relatively new at one point. And so, you see those, and then you go look and you see that the classification schedules have been updated and there's a new subdivision, and then you have to figure out what to do with your old ones. Cuttering, I think that's one of the, it's if you like to do puzzles, it's kind of a fun thing to do. And, I always say in all my classes, I teach about classification systems, to just follow the hierarchy and be specific in what you do. So when you figure out, if you're doing the subject analysis, you're the one assigning the subject. Of course, you're going to be as specific as you can be. But once you have that subject heading, that first subject heading, that primary subject heading, then that's what you're going to base your classification off of. So if you're doing subject analysis, that's a big bucket of work kind of outside of doing the call number. In some ways, that's, I think, the harder part of it, because once you get the subject heading, then that really does drive what your choice is going to be in terms of your base call number to start your cuttering. So follow the hierarchy. You want to make sure that when you're looking at things, if you're just, maybe your subject's in one of those areas where it falls into multiple things, like dogs, it falls into so many different categories, then you would want to make sure that you've selected the right dogs. If you have something that's about like veterinary treatment of dogs, you would want something that would be in that category. You wouldn't want to put it in the N category in fine arts. So you want to make sure that you're looking at your hierarchy and that you're fitting it into the right place. Check the tables, and we're going to talk more about the tables next week. It's okay to look in OCLC, and certainly if you're copy cataloging, that's really where you're going to look at your call number. I will talk about some things that you may watch for in OCLC. We'll talk about that sort of at the end of this class. But for this class, don't rely just on OCLC. Please do take the time to do your cuttering exercises. Make sure to take the time to actually do the work. And not everything I give you as an example is going to be in OCLC. So you won't be able to cheat. And I will say that catalogers can be wrong. So, and we're going to talk more about some of that. You always want to be unique in terms of what your call number is. We're going to talk about when call numbers repeat. So we'll talk about that on the last week. So I'll give you a little tease there. We'll talk about that at the end. Always follow the instructions in each class, in every table, even in the minute and lowly subclass. No matter how far you are, just know that instructions will vary among the classes and don't ignore them. Whatever you do, don't ignore your instructions. Follow them when you see them on the table. I already talked about call number conflicts, but you don't want to have them. And we'll talk about, like I said, we'll talk about at the end when it's actually okay to have two call numbers that are the same. So we'll talk about that. And on that note, see you next time. And we'll dive into more of this and continue on with all of your good discussion and enjoy writing your papers. And I'll see you next time. Bye.